Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our expert session webinar. Welcome. This is our Sustainable House Day expert session. We are so glad that you could join us. So first, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on the stolen lands of many First Nations people. I am speaking to you from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We would also like to acknowledge their elders past and present, that sovereignty was never ceded and this always was, always will be Aboriginal land. If you'd like, feel free to share which Aboriginal land you are watching from in the chat. Before the webinar begins, we'd like to tell you a bit about Sustainable House Day and Renew. Sustainable House Day is a national event that gives you access to Australia's most sustainable houses. This year, we're offering 4 themed weeks of online and in-person events around the country leading up to Sustainable House Day, which is the 17th of October, when we'll host a day of free online sessions with homeowners. This week is our retrofitting week, brought to you by Your Home, Ntters, and Design for Place. Thank you so much for making this event possible. You can visit sustainablehouseday.com to see detailed house profiles and tour videos for the 130 homes open this year and to book for our upcoming events. And I very much recommend checking out those home tours. There are some absolute crackers this year. Sustainable House Day is organised by Renew, a not-for-profit that inspires, enables, and advocates for people to live sustainably in their homes and communities. You can find more about us at renew.org.au. Tonight's session will begin with expert presentations and then move on to a Q&A session. You can ask questions at any point in the webinar this evening using Zoom's Q&A function, which you can find in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. So please use the Q&A box and not the chat to ask questions. The chat is for discussing the topics of this evening with your fellow attendees. So now I'd like to hand over to our MC for this evening, Renew's very own Dean Lombard. Dean is responsible for policy analysis and advocacy in national and state energy markets at Renew, with an emphasis on making the energy system work better for residential consumers while also reducing its environmental impact. He's passionate about ensuring that no one is left behind as we transition to a clean energy future. Qualified as a social worker, Dean worked in several community development roles, followed by a decade in energy policy advocacy for the Victorian Council of Social Service before joining Renew in 2016. Welcome, Dean.
Thanks, Maddie. Welcome, everybody. So great to see so many people here. As Maddie said, the way that this session will run is we're going to start with our presentations from our 2 experts. That'll take about the first hour, they're about half an hour each. Then we'll move on to a Q&A section where we can answer the questions that you have. And as Maddie said, please write questions in the Q&A and I'll be reading questions out from there. Our first presenter is Jenny Edwards. She's the owner, Managing Director and Lead Scientist at Lighthouse Architecture and Science, a multi-award-winning business with 15 staff that integrates building science with architecture to create highly efficient, climate-resilient homes in the ACT region. She's not an architect herself. She's got a master's degree in science and is an ACT licensed building energy efficiency assessor. She's been doing theoretical testing of designs using thermal performance software and physical building testing of built projects for their energy performance since 2009. He's very proud of her thermal camera and blower door. Jenny's home, which she designed, is open virtually for Sustainable House Day under the name Canberra Beach House. So with no further ado, I'll throw over to Jenny.
Well, thanks, Dean, and thanks, Maddie. I shall share my screen. Great. Thanks for your patience, everyone. And I'm just going to check the time to make sure I don't run over time. As Dean said, my business is called Lighthouse Architecture and Science, and I'm a scientist. And we're all about designing smaller, smarter, sustainable homes suited to the Canberra climate. So specifically for this climate, to suit the client and the site. And all electric goes hand in hand with everything we do. And it's not just about new builds, we also do major renovations and small scale retrofits. Let's get moving. Why is that not moving along? I can't move to the next slide, Dave.
Just give it a couple of clicks.
Okay, cool. First of all, these are the things that people say to us every time they come to contact Lighthouse. These are the words that people use to describe the home they want. And as I've already mentioned in that lead slide, all of these things go hand in hand with energy efficiency, sustainability, and an all-electric home. So the main thing tonight, and I'm preaching to a converted crowd, but so many people go into their homes and renovate them or build new homes without thinking about these things up front. So it's really important not to miss the opportunity to do this great stuff. So tonight I'm going to be talking about the two sort of key things, talking about the efficiency of the house and the efficiency of the appliances in it. And I'll use a particular case study, a renovation project. But before I do that, I'm going to talk about our climate here in Canberra. I know people are watching from all around the country, but here in Canberra, we've got a really extreme climate. We go from -8 in winter to 44 degrees in summer. So it's really extreme, but our energy requirements are dominated by our space conditioning, which is predominantly heating. So 62% of the typical Canberra home's energy consumption is for heating and cooling, mainly heating. And then water heating makes up the next big chunk, 16%. And cooking's only down there at 3%, but I just draw those three out because they're the three major appliances I'm going to be talking about tonight. Before I do, this is my own home. I walk the talk. It's an all-electric home. I've done, as Dean mentioned, it's available open for the virtual Sustainable House Day this year. There's also articles about it. But I wanted to show you the energy consumption here in my all-electric home compared to a typical Canberra family home. So the blue shows you the typical Canberra family home, where most of them, sadly, are still heated with gas and have gas cooking and have gas hot water. So their gas consumption is large. Their electricity consumption is small, but so is the consumption at my house, and I don't have the gas. So when you compare them, my house is using about 1/6 of the energy of a typical family Canberra home. And if we look at that in terms of costs, again, massively reduced costs. And there's an article about the way I heat my home in Renew called A Tale of Three Winters. But let's dive into the case study. So tonight I really want to focus on a classic little house. It's a 1980s house. Nothing particularly endearing about it from the outside. The pictures on the left show you the before shots. It was really in need of some love and attention, but it had huge potential, which the clients thought it might have, and we certainly thought it did as soon as we saw it. So let me take you through. Oh, I should note this was built by a fantastic local builder called In-Depth Building Solutions, who really loves doing these sustainability-focused renovations. So it was completed in May last year. It started with an EER, an energy efficiency rating, or a Ntters, a National House Energy Rating Scheme, star rating of 3.8 stars, which is actually pretty good. And that's because it had good orientation, and I'll show you that in the next slide. But we took it all the way up to 7.7, which is a massive increase because that scale is not linear. Again, I'll show you the change in their energy consumption. We only increased the size of the house by 13 square metres. So it finished up at 136 square metres, still a modest sized home. And the beautiful photos you see tonight were taken by Ben Wrigley in November of 2020. So when the clients first contacted us, we get the clients to fill in an online questionnaire to capture their brief. And they initially filled in a questionnaire about a knockdown rebuild, but they did note that, oh, we're open to the idea of renovation if you think it has potential. So as soon as we saw the site plan for the house, we did relay back to them very quickly that the house had tremendous potential. So you can see the north arrow over here. So north is pretty much straight up the page. So the living areas are on this side of the home, and 2 bedrooms already had great northerly access. So we also asked the clients to tell us what they really want to achieve with their project. And this, the bits I've captured here are really focused on the functionality side of things, but a big emphasis was on the energy efficiency and improved comfort. Like many houses of this era, it had very little good storage space, had one tiny pokey bedroom, and these people were really craving lots of storage, particularly bookshelves, you'll see highlighted twice. They mentioned bookshelves, and they wanted a third living space that could be a multi-use sort of space. But down the bottom, you'll see they stress they wanted light filled, but good shading in summer and good connection to outdoors, good thermal performance. They're really after good solar passive design with whatever they did. This slide is to make me pause and to take the opportunity to stress to everyone interested in doing building or renovating or improving a home to make it more sustainable and energy efficient. You have to be serious about space efficiency. The biggest way to save on resources, to save on upfront cost, and to save on running costs is to design efficiently. So well-designed smaller spaces can feel and function like much larger spaces. So I really encourage people not to be drawn into the bigger is better talk that the real estate industry will often tell you. Smaller can work really, really well. And that's what this project again demonstrates so nicely. So this is the before plan over on the left, and then after down here on the right. We did a little pop out to the western end, a tiny pop out to the south, but other than that, we just reconfigured within the existing footprint. And I'll show you that a bit more clearly. So the existing house, again, north, straight up the page, the living area already had great access to that. However, it was weirdly partly cut off from the dining space, which then really weirdly had this angled wall, which cleverly someone in the 1990s had thought they'd renovate and put in an angled wall, which then created this massive dead space that was good for nothing. They did put in a big sliding door to the east, which was a nice opportunity for morning winter sun, but it was completely unshaded, so it got pelted in summer. We fixed that. There's very little storage in the largest bedroom, a little bit more in the second, and then this tiny pokey room with a big window to the south and the wet areas through here. So we took down those walls in the living space to combine the living and dining, so this area functioned much better. Took out that weird angled wall, made much better use of the space down here for the kitchen, improved the connection through to the yard, did pergolas to shade the eastern window, and as I mentioned before, popped out to the west, only 13 square metres total here, and this little pop out under the eave here, to create this third space that functioned, was very flexible. So it was the craft space, the working from home space, the teenagers retreat, the guest room. It's got a day bed and a loft bed, and now has got this big window to the north, which allows it to take advantage of solar passive gain over winter. And again, it's beautifully shaded in summer and lovely connection to the outdoors. So really clever. And you'll see there's increased storage right throughout. Another integrated desk space for working from home. The laundry becomes a beautiful extension of the kitchen, and the bathroom and toilet. Rather than doing two bathrooms, we've just, by popping out, created enough space to put a second toilet in, which is really what most people are actually after. They don't really want two bathrooms to clean, they just want the second toilet. Some before shots, that's that living room looking north. You can see a ducted gas heating outlet there. Take note of the lovely mid-century furniture because you'll see it in the next shot. This is that living space now. So exactly the same size window, but we've replaced it with double glazing. We've created lots of nice storage, a window seat, but lots of lovely storage for books. There's no holes in that ceiling, apart from the one ceiling fan with an integrated light. And now the only form of heating down this end of the house is one split system, a reverse cycle air conditioning unit on the wall there. This is down the other end of the house in the multi-purpose room, or the loft room we created. So this room previously ended here. It was really tiny and pokey. We pushed out to the west, allowing us to put a window around this corner facing north, and put in a day bed and a loft bed, and putting a small window to the south to give us the cross ventilation. Looking north now, you can see that northern window, which this is a stacking double glazed door or window that folds right back. So you can have lovely indoor, outdoor you know, in the autumn and spring, you can be indoors and outdoors, or in the cooler parts of summer, but over winter, it's a nice, snug, well-glazed space. And you can see, again, lots of storage, a double bed up the top there, and a day bed down the bottom. I never miss the opportunity to talk about Ntters Modeling as well. I've briefly touched on that with this project, and I won't harp on about it because I did a webinar about this last week, which I encourage you to check out. But we really do optimise, actually I haven't talked about it yet in relation to this project, but we optimise the design right from the concept stage. So we're using the modelling software from the first concept sketches. This tool is meant to be used as a design tool, but sadly it tends to be used as a compliance tool by the Australian housing industry because it's very misunderstood and underutilised. So with this house, here's one crude screen capture that I've annotated. This, the house I mentioned before was originally at 3.8. This is actually the modelling I did during the second stage of design. And one of the beauties of this software is that not only gives you a rating for the overall house, which is what the 7.6 represents, it also tells you how each zone of the home is performing and the predicted cooling and heating loads. So you can really use it to check that each part of the home is performing, and you can check things like the appropriate glazing size, because areas of glass, in Canberra you can't get away with as much glass as you can in some climates. So we optimise the glazing area, so the size of the windows, and check the shading arrangements as well. All sorts of things. The exact construction is modelled in the software. But I said I wouldn't go on about that, so I'll move on. So in summary, when it comes to about the efficiency of the house, what I want to stress with this project we designed for the site and we designed for our climate. So you would do different things on a different site and in a different part of Australia. But here in the ACT, we're very familiar what we need to do. And here we have such a great opportunity for passive solar gain because we get so much free sunshine over winter. So the existing house was already doing that quite well. So we wanted to continue that. We did improve the shading over summer, so particularly to that eastern outdoor area. Cross ventilation is really important as well. So we make sure all of our windows are openable, and we also install ceiling fans in pretty much every room except your bathroom and toilet. They've got exhaust fans. Then when it comes to insulation and windows, I consider the windows to be part of the insulation of the building envelope. What we did at this house was top up the ceiling to R5 insulation. Sometimes people want to go beyond that, but in terms of bang for buck, R5 is really very good. And we installed R2.5 bats to the external walls. Because this renovation was fairly major, most of the internal plasterboard lining came down, so we were able to install bats. We often do retrofit blow-in products as well. And I think I mentioned already that all the glazing is double glazing and it's UPVC framed. The other thing we focus on a lot, which gives fantastic bang for buck, is draft sealing. But I always stress that when you talk about draft sealing, you also have to talk about ventilation. They absolutely go hand in hand. So through good design and simple design things, we minimise the penetrations through that building envelope. So that's why I pointed out that we've got the one ceiling fan and the integrated light in the living room. We don't have lots of downlights and other things going on. In that way, we're reducing the opportunity for air leakage through the ceiling, and we're also ensuring that the insulation is nice and thoroughly installed. So we think about that when we do our lighting design and our house design, and then it's up to the builder during construction to just have that attention to detail. It's not rocket science, it's just good quality construction. I mentioned ventilation, though, goes hand in hand with that, and it is really important to have quality exhaust fans in the wet areas. So those areas where you're generating lots of moisture. So we always install a good exhaust fan that is ducted out to outside. It doesn't just release the hot air into the roof space. So that's what we've done here. Now onto the appliances. So this house did have central gas ducted heating, and it did have instantaneous gas hot water, and it had gas cooking just so typical. I imagine 90% of the houses around this one would be in that situation. These clients were really happy and very keen to convert to all electric, and it really is a no-brainer. It makes such great sense, and when you see their energy bills, you won't be able to argue against that. So what we did here was introduce 2 split systems, reverse cycle air conditioning systems, one in each living area. So this is the one, the external unit for one that sits on the wall in the loft living area. The other one sits down the other end of the house and conditions that the main living area I showed you earlier. And then this is the hot water heat pump. In this case, this is a Sandon hot water heat pump, which is super efficient, super quiet, works really well in the extreme cold of Canberra. We've had no problems with them at all. They're fantastic. I've got one just outside my bedroom window here. So another shot, just a different angle on the same thing, stressing again, heat pumps really are the go. They work so well, and don't be put off by some of the old guard plumbers out there who will tell you that heat pumps are no good for cold climates or they're really noisy. There were some rubbish ones in the past. There are probably still some rubbish ones available, but there are plenty of really good ones as well. Now, the proof that this all worked, there's a lot going on in this slide, so I'll take you through it slowly. I just want to talk about the operational energy mainly, but I'm also going to touch on embodied energy down the bottom. And if we look at the energy consumption in this house in the year before it was renovated, so from July to October, a 3-month period, when it had gas hot water, gas heating and gas cooking, plus electricity to run all the appliances, the average daily energy use was 40.4 kilowatt hours per day. Pretty hefty, but not uncommon for Canberra homes. Then last year, when they moved in, as the global pandemic was kicking off, and both their parents were working from home, and their one teenage son was also homeschooled for a chunk of that time. And we're actually comparing to a July to November period when the power was turned on. For some reason, they did, instead of a quarter, they did a third. So we're actually comparing to a longer period. But the average daily consumption was way down to 12.7 kilowatt hours per day, even though they were at home a lot more. So, virtually a 70% reduction in total energy use over that period. So more than that if we were comparing 3 months to 3 months, and the same, if the pandemic hadn't changed conditions. So huge difference. And that equates to 1,320 kilowatt hours per person per year, and a total energy consumption of just under 4,000 kilowatt hours. Now, that's 1/5 of a typical Canberra home, so a pretty massive improvement all round. I also, again, just want to harp on this, embodied energy, space efficiency. If you're serious about energy efficiency, then make it small. Design it well so those spaces are super functional and there's no dead space left. The heating, I've already mentioned it, but again, predominantly we're actually using the passive solar gain. So now that the building envelope is so well insulated, all that lovely sunshine streams in through these north-facing windows well beyond the end of this coffee table at winter solstice. So loads of free heat coming in, and remembering there's a big eastern door over just sort of behind this view. So they also get some morning sun streams in across the dining room and into the kitchen. So plenty of free heat on sunny mornings. Then if we do need to supplement things, there's the very efficient Dakin split system on the wall, and that's only a 3.5 kilowatt system. The one down the other end is 2.5 kilowatt. The house does have some under tile heating in the bathroom, so not in slab, but under the tiles, which runs on a thermostat. In terms of cooling, the house doesn't need much cooling, again, because it's designed well to be shaded in summer for good cross ventilation and using ceiling fans and the ability to vent overnight. But here in Canberra, we all experienced the summer before last when we had the horrific smoke smoky conditions where we couldn't open up our houses and cross-ventilate. So that's when a lot of our homes, for the first time, started using those split systems for cooling as well as heating. So just topping up during those heat waves. Very, very quickly, because as Dean said in the intro, I'm very proud of my blower door and my thermal camera. We do test during construction to check that the house has been designed and built as specified. So these two tools are very helpful for that. And when it comes to air tightness, again, I can go on about draft sealing and air tightness for hours. Not very sexy, but incredible in terms of thermal bang for buck. I want to stress with this house, it was a 1980s house. It doesn't even have any sarking to the outside of the frame. We didn't put any sarking in, and we didn't use any air barrier membrane behind the plasterboard lining. So we've just used that plasterboard lining as the internal envelope, and there's the air barrier. And doing that, we've managed to achieve very high levels of air tightness, much, much better than your typical new Australian home. So I just want to stress here that don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Don't get paralysed by the idea that you have to have passive house levels of air tightness. That's the German passive house system, which has a strong focus on air tightness. You don't have to go to that level to achieve really significant improvements in existing homes, and they can still be healthy. They can still have good internal air quality and have good ventilation and not have mould issues. So it really is possible. I think I'm nearly, I've got 3 minutes to go. So the clients are really happy. This house has actually won 2 quite prestigious architecture awards earlier this year and is a finalist in the MBA and the HIA awards, which is really nice because previously smaller projects like this didn't attract much attention in those sort of award campaigns, but now people are starting to realise that these homes really do have potential. Now I'm just going to quickly roll through some before and after shots because it's fun to see. Before, after, that lovely loft space with the north-facing windows. Down the bottom, they open right up to that bench seat outside, and there's a smaller window upstairs. The dining room before, with that strange angled room before, angled wall behind it. And now, so we've taken those crazy walls out and opened it right up. Again, notice very few penetrations in the ceiling, few LED downlights there, nice and airtight. The kitchen before really was very strange. It's now great. And there's the lovely induction cooktop I forgot to point out earlier. Same another angle. This is part of that weird dead space in the kitchen. When they put that angled wall in, there was just this room or space that did nothing. We've now transformed that, so there's lots of storage and functional space. The laundry is a lovely extension of the kitchen. The bedroom beforehand, the main bedroom now with lots of storage. So remembering the bedrooms we haven't changed their floor area. We've just reconfigured the joinery. The bathroom, classic 80s bathroom, modernised now, took out the bath, created space for an extra toilet. The back of the house before, the back of the house now. And the clients, as I said before, are very, very happy. And how am I going for time? I think my time is about to go off. So I do want to point out Renew has fantastic resources about getting off gas and going all electric. There's also a terrific website developed here in the ACT last year by the ACT Conservation Council called Make the Switch, which has some terrific resources on it. So I also encourage people to check that out. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. That was fabulous. We've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to save them mostly for the Q&A, but one quick one that's very relevant just to this case, Jenny, was what was the total cost of that reno?
Oh, now this is, I always have to premise this with Canberra is a very expensive place to build. So this one was just under 400. Now, to put that into perspective, a new house of that size in Canberra would have cost well over 500,000. In the current market, it would cost over 700,000. So keep that in mind. So it's not cheap. So this wasn't cheap, but they got a whole new house. I do want to stress that we do small scale retrofits too. So we work with clients with $5,000 and $10,000 budgets. And look at our website, you'll see people who've achieved similar reductions in energy consumption just by focusing on draft ceiling and insulation without new kitchens, new bathrooms, those things. Cool.
Great, thanks. And look, we'll keep moving on because we're running time, and don't worry about the questions. We'll get them all in the Q&A. So I'd like to introduce our next expert. This is Richard Keach. Richard's a freelance consultant in building energy efficiency and renewable energy at New Energy Thinking. He's an engineer, consultant, and author with a particular interest in renewable energy and energy efficiency. He has master's degrees in both engineering, electronics, and environment, energy efficiency. He was a key author of the Zero Carbon Australia Buildings Plan and is a regular contributor to Renew's publications on topics related to energy efficiency. Richard lives in Melbourne with his family in their zero carbon home. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you for that introduction, Dean. Can everyone see my slides?
Yeah.
And I should say that I'm not in Melbourne any longer. This is where I live now. This is not the topic of tonight's talk, but like Jenny, I'm a Sustainable House Day homeowner, and my house here, known as Straight House, is a featured house that you can find on the website. It's great. I'm here on the lands of the Bunurong people, and let's get into it. So the context for this, renewable energy and energy efficiency are my professional life. Most of the time I work for NHAR, is a company that does sustainable energy consulting. My freelance outfit, as Dean mentioned, New Energy Thinking, generally do that one day a week. So just for context there, I like to keep my hand in on the consulting to private clients doing residential improvements, and that's where I do the freelance stuff, whereas the NHAR is more commercial. So I'm also the author of the Energy Freedom Home book. I was engaged to write that by Beyond Zero Emissions. And you can find me online at the Facebook group called My Efficient Electric Home, which will soon be about 35,000 people strong. So on to the topic of tonight. So why electrify? The short answer, well, methane has problems. Methane is natural gas. The emissions aren't as low as they were. They're not as low as people think. They're getting worse. And I think there's a looming shortage of affordable gas. And if we continue using it, then it amounts to a proliferation, or it'll lead to a proliferation of coal seam gas. There are safety issues around gas. On the other hand, electricity is getting cleaner, and electrification is getting cheaper, and there are bonus benefits, which we'll talk about. So in this session, I'll mainly be focusing on just helping people understand why gas is problematic and why it's not low emissions, and really about what this whole electrification concept is. What are the other benefits of it? And I'll talk a bit about my own experience in retrofitting for all electric. So methane. First thing is global warming potential. People would possibly know that global warming potential is, it's effectively a scaling factor that we apply when we talk about greenhouse gases to make them comparable, or to put them on the same scale as CO2. So when it comes to natural gas or methane, when looked at over a 100-year time horizon, global warming potential of methane 25. So 25 times as strong. 1 kilo of CO2, 25 kilos of CO2 will have the same impact as only 1 kilo of methane over 100 years. But over a shorter time horizon, then methane is stronger because its residence time in the atmosphere is less. And the other thing is that over the course of a number of different assessments with the IPCC, they've revised their estimates upwards. So the trouble is that a lot of the emissions accounting around gas in Australia or globally is using the 100-year time, the old 100-year time horizon value of 25, when we should be using the newer 20-year time horizon values to properly calculate the impact of gas. That is the gas that gets released directly into the atmosphere. So emissions associated with methane, in an ideal world, you've got the source of methane, goes through production, processing, transmission, distribution, and some sort of end use, burns in air, and you get CO2 and water. But actually things are much more complicated than that. The source of methane also has CO2 and other impurities in it, and invariably some of them get released to atmosphere along the way before the end use device. And air isn't just oxygen. So when we burn it, we don't just get CO2, we get water, there can be carbon monoxide, there can be unburned methane, and there can be nitrogen oxide. So things aren't quite as simple as the industry would have you believe. So the key thing here is the amount of gas that customers, well, when gas users consume gas, if they consume a kilo of gas, then there's more than a kilo of gas that has to be produced to get that to the end use device, because stuff gets, it leaks and is otherwise emitted to atmosphere without burning along the way. And how much is that? Well, there are various estimates of that. This chart is from a Melbourne University publication, and it just shows some methane emissions from different gas fields in the US. And you can see that they're 10%, 8%, 5%, 10%, 9%. So these are significant proportions of the resource that are getting lost to atmosphere before it makes it to the end. Whereas in Australia, the official government figures are less than 1%. So the net result is that if we applied real world likely leakage rates and applied the proper global warming potential, then methane isn't the clean green fuel that the industry would have you believe it is. So don't want to labour the point. Most of you are here to talk about houses, but I did want to just give this perspective that I think is lost in the general discussion about emissions. And off the back of the recent release of the IPCC 6th assessment report, we really need to emphasise and underscore just how important it is that we care about the emissions of things that we do. So my first electrification journey was the retrofitting of this house in suburban Essendon. And I think this was largely a process where I'm teaching myself about energy efficiency and making things better. And the story of the improvement of this house was also the story of my transition into this industry as a renewable energy and energy efficiency professional. In 2006, this house with a family of 4 consumed 80 gigajoules of energy. So it's fairly typical for a house in Melbourne. Most of that was gas. So each bar on this chart is a month. And the red bits are gas energy. The blue bits are electrical energy. And you can see how there's that peak in the middle of the year. That's characteristic of a southern hemisphere heating dominant climate. So, so much of the energy we use, as Jenny said earlier, goes towards heating in the middle of the year. So that sets a good baseline. And so over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, I made improvements to the house, the thermal envelope, and by the way, this is the underlying consumption, and is for the sake of this analysis decoupled from the solar on the roof. So this is just the underlying consumption of the house. So as the house gets better, the thermal envelopes gets better, the appliances get better. The usage is still the same through all this. You can see that it's all coming down, and then see what's happened there in October 2011. We disconnected from gas, no more gas. So the red bars disappear. And in 2012, you can see the electricity use has gone up a bit, but overall the energy use has still continued down. So I considered mission accomplished in 2013. So it's a 7-year journey towards the all-electric efficient retrofit. And the end result was that in 2013, my house used 75% less energy. So we went from 80 gigajoules electricity and gas combined in 2006 to 20 gigajoules of energy in 2013. So really happy with the result. And what that chart doesn't adequately show is that the house is a better house at the end of the day. So there's no compromise associated with using a lot less energy. On the contrary, we're more comfortable, happier people. So so that's a very quick rundown of my personal first electrification journey. And next I want to talk about electrification and the whole concept of this is an emerging sort of frame of thinking around how we're going with energy in this world. And you'll there's about to be a book released by a fellow named Saul Griffiths about electrification, so you'll probably start to see this term used more and more. And this is my take on it. And the first point is that, I sum it up by the idea that wires beat pipes. So gas is an energy source. It involves the combustion of that material, giving us heat and products of combustion. It's really a one-trick pony. You burn it. Whereas on the other hand, electronics and wires, they're a solid state technology. Oops, whoa. That wasn't supposed to happen. Sorry about that. Okay. Not sure what I pressed there. Anyway, electronics and wires, solid state, there's no products of combustion, intrinsically simpler and more reliable and safe than combustion and pipes. So a good example that I like is that our homes are made safer with safety switches in your switchboard. And they're a really clever piece of small technology that most people overlook. But it's something that's done so easily and so transparently, whereas there's no easy, simple, cheap equivalent in when it comes to gas. Electricity is so versatile, it can be used to carry both energy and information. And I think that duality is the heart of what makes electricity so powerful. And that as an energy carrier can be transformed directly to heat, light, sound, motion, stored energy. And most of those transformations are reversible, at least to a certain degree. On top of all that, we've got the great potential to generate so much of our energy at home from the sun. Electricity is a better fit with modern digital technology. It gives us easy ability to add smart features. It's easier to meter. And electronic and electrical systems scale amazingly well. So from a pacemaker through to a PV panel to a pumped hydro plant, it's all the same underlying energy, but it scales really, really well, both in the sense of the end use and also in terms of the way it's generated. I want to take a minute to think about energy classification in terms of low grade versus high grade. This is sort of engineering thinking, but bear with me a minute because I think it'll get to a good place of understanding things a bit better. High grade energy is where you've got really great temperature differences. So for example, a gas flame can give up to 1900 degrees C. An electric arc furnace can give similar temperatures. This is really intense temperatures. Whereas low-grade heat, it's where there's low temperature differences. Like home space heating, what we need is temperatures around 25 C. Domestic hot water, 40 to 60 C. So there's this idea in efficiency that you don't use high-grade energy when low-grade energy will do. So why start with 1900 degrees? Or why start with a fuel that can give us 1900 degrees when at the end of the day, what you only need is 25. It's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So imagine if we had an abundant free low grade source of heat energy. Wouldn't that be better? Well, as it happens, the ambient air and water around us actually do serve as a reservoir of useful heat energy. So let's drill down into that idea that ambient heat is an important concept. And to understand that better, it's useful to distinguish between heat energy on the one hand versus temperature on the other hand. So that low-grade heat energy is all around us. And I don't mean that air is carrying heat in some sort of metaphorical sense. This is literal. Air is a source of heat energy. There's heat in the air. And it's effectively infinite and renewable. So if we take heat energy out of that air, it makes it colder, and that thing can then be rewarmed in the ambient outside by the sun. So heat energy is like a fluid. It moves from one place to another, and it naturally flows down the metaphorical hill. So it's a heat gradient, as engineers would call it, but you can think of it like a hill. Whereas its tendency of heat is to naturally flow from high temperature to low temperature, but we can force it up the hill as well. So that's what heat pumps do. So this is what's amazing about heat pumps, and Jenny eloquently made the point about how important heat pumps are. So the point about heat pumps is a little bit of electricity. Now remember, electricity is a high-grade source of energy, but what we want is a low-grade heat. A little bit of electricity can move a lot of heat energy. So you don't need your mains energy supply to actually be your source of heat when low-grade heat's what you need. So that's the essence. That's my way of sort of explaining why heat pumps are so magical, is that they harness that ability to grab heat energy out of the outside air. So the next part of this story is what I call a tale of three grids. We've got in our society multiple energy grids or supply systems. So obviously the electricity grid, but we've got that gas supply system or gas grid, and for transport energy, we've got petrol supply as well. And each of these is a little silo of capability of delivering energy. But electricity makes gas and petrol increasingly redundant as an energy source. Anyone driving an EV will understand how not using petrol is a really good thing. And people who have gone all electric at home, likewise with respect to gas. So we can avoid the societal cost of gas and petrol when we switch to electricity. Zero carbon becomes an economic proposition. When we use only one grid, as a customer, we've got a single daily service charge. One grid equals a single energy account. And let's think about the role of the electricity grid. I mean, this might sound a strange question, but the traditional thinking is to think of the grid as a supply system. And in that framework, the customers only consume, and their energy is centralized. Energy generation is centralized, and customers are at the end of the chain, so to speak. But I think an emerging reframing of the role of the electricity grid is to think of it as a sharing system, or if you like, a sharing and a balancing system. But let's focus on the sharing part of that. So when customers produce and consume energy, then the role, well, the way I look at it is when a household starts producing at least as much energy as they consume, then the role of the grid becomes a sharing system, not just a supply system. And so this mental reframe is a useful way to help deflect lines of argument around that you hear when people say, oh, I want to go off grid. Well, sorry, if you go off grid, it introduces a whole lot of extra complexity at a household level, and you stop being able to share your surplus energy. So home electrification nearly always involves solar, at least when you've got a freestanding house. And at various times you'll nearly always have surplus, and you want to be able to sell that. So if you're disconnected from the grid, then you can't do that. So the next concept in the electrification story is the idea of diversification. So can the grid cope with more different uses? Well, when we displace gas and petrol, and when we introduce a diversity in the pattern of timing of energy use and energy generation, then we get a better utilization of the existing asset, being the grid. So the grid is fundamentally constrained by power mostly, not by energy. So in other words, the grid is scaled to deliver the peak amount of power that we need in worst case conditions. But if the grid isn't well utilized, then the average power delivered can be quite a lot less than that peak. But when you start to have many different roles for electricity in many different places at many different times, then on average, you get much better utilization of the grid. So in other words, we can tend to get more energy through the grid within the same capacity of the pipelines, if you like, just because what electrical engineers call electrical diversity, where the things are consumed at different times by different things. So on average, the utilization goes up. And we can go further with smart management technology to help keep within the operating limits of the grid. So in summary, you've got this idea of diversified loads, diversified generation with a common energy transport is a much, much better way to go than having these three different parallel energy delivery systems in gas, petrol, and electricity. So for example, charging loads for electric vehicles have different peak patterns than summertime air conditioning, for example. So you don't have to add the peak of both of those to understand the peak impact of having both of those. So is it economic? Well, I like to look at this slide and looking at the comparison between replacing ducted gas with split systems. So this is a so-called Sankey diagram prepared as part of the Zero Carbon Australians Buildings Plan, the graphic by Alistair Leith. And this is showing from left to right gas energy coming into the system and in the scenario where what we're looking for is 10 megajoules of usefully delivered heat. And along the way that we've got flue losses and duct losses and waste delivered heat and a bit of electricity to drive the fan. But overall, we need 33 megajoules of energy just to deliver 10 of usefully delivered heat. We replace that gas ducted system with an efficient split system in the scenario of needing the same usefully delivered heat. We only need 2.3 megajoules to deliver and a bit of fan energy. And we're sucking a bunch of free ambient heat. So here's the point that I was making before about ambient heat, is that the magic of split systems or heat pumps generally is that most of the heat you're delivering is actually coming from the outside air. So in this example, we're comparing the width of this blue line here on the left to the width of this little blue line here on the right as the effective improvement. And that's about a 13:1 ratio. In other words, to deliver the same 10 megajoules of heat into the house, we need about 1/13 of the energy into the system. So even if the gas costs less than electricity to start with, we're going to use less energy in the process. And many people's experience in switching to electric heating and cooling is that it generally reduces their cost of heating by about a factor of 2 or 3 in practical terms. So this is not theoretical. It's my experience. It's other people's experience. So I want to finish up. There's a new analysis that I'm doing for the Cape, just a bit of a preview. I was commissioned by Brendan Condon at the Cape Development, which happens to be where I also now live, to assess the cost and emissions of going all electric for the combination of the type of house built here at the Cape, plus an EV in comparison with a typical 6-star household with a internal combustion engine car. So we can. That's the sort of the main scenarios, the start and the end point scenarios, if you like, for comparison, and a whole bunch of assumptions of how a house operates, and what sort of vehicles we're comparing. And the results are going to be published soon. And I'm not really at liberty to divulge the actual numbers today, but the results support the idea that we can feasibly and affordably proceed to broad scale electrification and expect that it's not going to overwhelm the grid. We can expect that it's going to save us money and that we can put that money saved towards actually doing the improvements. In the course of the analysis, the potential savings exceeded what I expected that they would achieve. So if you want to read more about my ideas about electrification, I had this article published last week in the Fifth Estate, and that's it. So thank you very much. If you're interested in efficient all electric retrofits, feel free to go and get the book, The Energy Freedom Home. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. That was really interesting, going into all those sort of details about gas and electricity and the transition. We've got a lot of questions for the Q&A, so I'll do my best to get through as many of them as I can. Before we do start the Q&A, I just want to introduce our other two panelists for the Q&A. These are both people who've got homes on display for the virtual Sustainable House Day. And yeah, there has been a question on the website about links to people's homes, Richard's and Jenny's, as well as the other two who are here. So we'll make sure I'm sure Maddie, can we send out links to people of those 4 homes on the SHD website? Would be great. So our two other panelists, first Malcolm McKelvey, who has the Yarragon straw bale home in Victoria. This house has straw bale and rammed earth walls, apricus evacuated tube and wood heater boosted hot water, all electric appliances and a 7.5 kilowatt PV system. He's got spray foam insulation in the roof and an off-grid hybrid battery system using secondhand lead acid batteries. And then we also have Dylan Stone, wanted a truly passive home with a simple modern look, comfortable every day of the year without air conditioning or heating, even in the brutalist heat waves and the coldest days of winter. Using natural and renewable materials and waste products is also very important. And they decided that the best way to achieve this was by also building with straw bale, but they didn't want the cottage look. So using clever design and skilled tradespeople, they've got the thermal, ecological and health benefits of straw bale construction in a modern, beautiful home. So thanks, Dylan and Malcolm, for joining us for the Q&A panel. And yeah, you'll be able to have a look at their homes on Sustainable House Day website. So I'm going to start going through the questions that we've got in the Q&A. There's a few that are similar. I'll try to group them together. I think the first one I'll ask, and I think this is probably something for all of you to think about, but maybe particularly Jenny, from Sharon in Victoria. With retrofitting an existing home to an all-electric home, how do you prioritize where to start? Your slides, Jenny, showed the percentage of energy attributed to the various services. So should you start with the high energy services like gas ducted heating, and then the cooker, and then the hot water, or what's the best way to do it?
The best way to do it is to have a plan. So to be thinking about it now. This is where I draw your attention to some great information that Renew have got, and that website I mentioned, Make the Switch. So if you've got hot water is a big consumer of energy, and everyone's hot water system will die at some point. So a really important thing is to have a plan in place. So when it dies, you don't get, fooled into replacing it with another gas system. You get a gas person out to look at it, and they'll want to sell you another gas system. So think about it in advance. So have a plan for your hot water, but I'm not suggesting you throw out an existing hot water system if it's still working, but be ready for that one. Then the cooking, again, if you're planning any kitchen upgrades, then make the switch to induction. And all of you out there who think that gas is the only good way to cook, there are plenty of chefs and plenty of fancy restaurants that use induction now, and it really is incredibly sensitive and really good. In terms of gas heating, a lot of people think they can't possibly live without it. The number one thing there is to improve your comfort levels and the efficiency of your home, and that comes down to the really unsexy things of draft sealing and insulation. Those two things are not expensive. They can make a massive difference to how much energy is required in your home to keep it comfortable. So do those things, draft sealing and insulation, and then you'll be surprised how little heating your home will need. So I think I covered off on everything in that one.
Yeah, I think you did. And you also covered off the other part of that question, which I forgot to read out, which was what do you do? But what about the embodied energy that exists in appliances? And I think you sort of covered that, like, you don't need to rush in to replace an appliance. That's perfectly good. But, when it's time to replace it, that can be.
Yeah, just have that plan ready.
It's a bit of a balancing act. There's quite a few questions about heating. So I might go to some of those now. One person asked, I think thinking about that you've both talked about reverse cycle split systems. How do you keep the non-living areas warm if the split systems are in the living areas?
Well, in my retrofit improvement, we added 7 indoor split units, but that was done as 2 multi-split arrangements. So 7 main rooms, so it's bedrooms, dining, living. So most of the spaces had a split system, but there's only 2 outdoor units. So multi-split system has multiple head units for a single outside unit. And so that meant that pretty well all the spaces that bathroom, toilet, and so on don't need their own separate heater. And so yeah.
And I would say that people can't sort of comprehend that once you have addressed draft ceiling and insulation, you'd be amazed how little heating is required. So in most of our projects, there is no heating in the bedrooms because they're so well insulated, they're nice and draft sealed, so that the human bodies overnight generate enough heat that we actually here in Canberra even have the windows open pretty much all year round. So you don't necessarily need heating. And in the wet areas like Richard, we don't ever heat a toilet. We might have the under tile heating in a bathroom, but it doesn't get used a lot. So again, it's a switch in thinking. Most people live in these really drafty, poor insulated houses where they feel super uncomfortable, but it can be very different.
Now, on the, sorry, go on.
I was just going to chip in.
Yeah.
In our house, we've got one central wood heater to heat the whole house. We put in heat shifting ducts. One system to go to one end, another system to go to the other end. But we do live in, it's a very well insulated straw bale house. It's quite airtight, and we don't really need to use the heat shifting things. Our daughter often flicks it on and to heat, up the other end of the house. But I agree heartily with Jenny that draft proof and insulate, and yeah, it's quite comfortable.
Thanks.
But if you were going to do the heat shifting idea, make sure the ducts are really well insulated. Because if they're not, if you go for crappy little ducts, they'll lose all the heat by the time they get to the other end of the house.
I did that in a house in WA before I became an energy efficiency nerd. I installed a shift system with crappy ducting, and by the time the air got across, it was cold. It was just did nothing. Yeah.
It works in our house because the spray foam insulation is above the ducts.
Yeah. Cool.
Yes. You mentioned the underfloor heating in the bathroom, Jenny. There was a question, and I can't see the question now, so I can't remember who asked it. But the question was, I've heard that that underfloor heating is sort of very expensive to run. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people confuse the under tile heating with in slab heating. So electric heating in slab is terribly inefficient, and I've seen some horrible energy guzzling homes that have those systems. So I'm not talking in slab. It just sits on top of there's an insulation layer put on top of the concrete, then the electric heating system, and then just the tiles. So any heat that is generated comes up through the tiles. So it's much more efficient, and we always have it set on a thermostat, so it's not running constantly. But of course, if you leave it on all day, set the thermostat really high, then it'll cost you money. So again, education is an important part of it. But I don't have under tile in my bathroom. I've got an infrared panel on the ceiling.
Yep, that's useful information. There was a question from Judd around split systems or sort of central heat pump heating and floor or ceiling ducts. What's the best? What are your thoughts and any view on the panel about the difference between those?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up often on the My Efficient Electric Home group, and I've written a blog post on this. So short answer, ducting is really not the way to go. There are so many things fundamentally broken with the way we do ducted heating. It has a centralized point of return, so you need to work properly, you need a clear air pathway back from every outlet to the return air, which works against the people's need to close doors from time to time. There's lots of heat loss in the ducts themselves. They frequently are associated with stratification, where I've assessed many homes where the air is delivered through outlets in the ceilings and is drawn from a return air also in the ceilings, And that's a recipe for disaster with stratification, because the heated air stays near ceiling level. And so you get maybe from waist high up to the ceiling warm, and then from your waist down to the floor is cold, because the air doesn't mix down to floor level properly. So a whole heap of problems with ducted, and I strongly recommend people don't do that.
Yeah, any opportunity to avoid putting holes in your ceiling too. One of the classics, Richard's talking about the stratification. One of the classic houses I visited had ducted gas heating in the ceiling, but also had evaporative cooling units in every room and loads of halogen downlight. So, and the heat was coming out and going whoosh up the evaporative cooling and whoosh up through the halogen downlight. So there was no way they could keep this house comfortable. The other thing about ducting is it does, over time, that you'll often get breaks in it or perforate, it'll get dusty and dirty. So I think you'll find everyone here tonight is pretty anti-ducting.
And maybe the last question on heating before we move on to some other topics is a few questions in the Q&A about hydronics. For example, from Guy, they've got a great gas hydronic system. Can they, what's the deal with, say, converting that to a heat pump hydronic system? And there's also a question from Leslie, just sort of general thoughts about hydronic heating and the in-slab electric, which I think you already mentioned. Jenny.
You go, Richard.
Yeah, people often really swear by hydronic. It has a great sort of word of mouth experience, but I think that's really off the back of so many poor houses having bad experiences with the alternatives. So Jenny will say, and I will, and my experience supports that you can get equivalent levels of radiant heat performance just by having a really well-performing thermal envelope. So you don't need hydronic heating systems to give performance equivalent to hydronic heating systems. Just insulate, really put the extra cost of a hydronic system towards making your thermal envelope better, and then a house heated with a split system will feel just as good.
Yep. And I can say I've lived both. My previous house I renovated and we put hydronic, gas fueled hydronic radiators throughout. I actually took an old split system out. Again, put it down to learning. And we used to do hydronic in quite a few of our houses 6-7 years ago. But we found it just was overkill. If you did get the building envelope right and you've designed for site, it's $20,000 plus that you didn't really need to spend. And as Richard said, spend that on your building envelope and those much less sexy things like insulation and draft sealing. Yeah.
And one last point, hydronic just does heating. You're also probably going to need a cooling system as well. So whereas the splits do both in one.
Yeah, good points. Are there any further thoughts on those questions from any of the other panelists? No, that's okay. We can move on. Maybe we'll move on to, there's a couple of questions about hot water. One question from Tony noticed in the house that you showed us, Jenny, the hot water cylinder on the outside of the house. Any thoughts about, from any of you, or experience of having a water tank inside the building rather than outside the building envelope? Does it make a difference, especially maybe in cooler areas?
I'm happy to say that here in my house, in the laundry, which is through that door and across the corridor, I've got my Sandon tank in a cupboard in the laundry. So yeah, it does make some sense in a colder climate in a well-designed house. The little house I showed simply didn't have space inside. They do take up a fair bit of space. So instead, we make sure the piping is really well insulated and it's closely located to where it's going to be used. But yeah, it's certainly something to think about, depending on where you live. Bringing the tank inside.
Yeah, my new house has, like Jenny's, a heat pump hot water system with an internal tank. And I must say, I was surprised That was in my hallway cupboard near the lounge room, and I had my lounge room temperature sensor not too far from that, and I was surprised that it was showing consistently about 2 degrees warmer than the rest of the house, which in a really well-performing house, every joule of heat lost through the walls of the tank is a joule less heat you need to generate with your heating system. So you get that extra efficiency bonus of being able to reuse the waste heat from the hot water as comfortable heat. In summer that works against you, but we're using in southern Australia much more energy for heating than for cooling. So on balance, it works in your favour. The other thing I'd say about hot water is people often tend to oversize the systems, and I don't think you can separate the question of how big a tank do they need from the type of shower head, because for most people in most contemporary use cases, the dominant form of hot water consumption is shower use. And if you can have a shower head that uses a half or a third of the flow as someone else's, then you need a half or a third the size of the tank, all other things being equal. And that's my experience. I have a 160 litre tank. At Easter, we had 4 or 5 people in the house. We've got 4.5 litre per minute shower heads, and you choose the right ones, and it's not a compromise. We're very happy with our Methane Emissions satin jet shower heads, and they let us get away with a much smaller tank, which means much less standing losses because the tank surface area is less. It also makes it easier to fit in a cupboard, and they're slightly cheaper.
I wonder if Dylan or Malcolm could share anything about what they've done with their hot water and how it's turned out.
Yeah, our hot water is we've got 40 Apricus evacuated tubes on the roof, and it's boosted from a wetback in the wood heater. There's no gas or electricity at all, and because of that, we have got the tankies inside the house in a sort of funny looking cupboard, very close to the fire, so that this thermosiphons up into the tank. And this year, for the first time, I was thinking, oh, maybe we're going to run out of firewood, dry firewood. So I did replace the 2 shower heads that were, I think, 9 litres a minute to the methane ones that are about 5 litres a minute. Thinking, I don't want to buy firewood, and I haven't got time at the moment to go and source more dry stuff, and so yeah, it's worked well.
Thanks.
I could jump in again with another, I guess, completely different to everyone else on the panel system. I've just got an old school, inefficient storage hot water unit, but I have a little smart box that makes it run purely from solar, so it's not as efficient at heating water as a heat pump, but most people who've got solar on their roof will find that they're exporting so much solar and getting very little for it. So you can use your own power generation to heat your hot water quite effectively.
Yeah, we see a few people doing that, and sort of conceptually, it's like an electric hot water system is sort of like a battery in that it can store that extra solar energy for use when you run. Yeah.
When you look at the charging, if you've got monitoring on your app, it almost looks exactly, or it does look exactly like a house battery or a car battery charging, in that the sun comes up. This is using a what's generally called a solar diverter. It can trick your hot water service into thinking it's infinitely variable. So it puts in, as the sun comes up, you're making 100 watts, 1,000 watts, 2 kilowatts, and it just, anything that you're not using in the house, it puts it towards the element in your hot water system. And so you get a charge curve that looks like a battery. So almost exactly like a battery, yeah.
Yeah, right. Interesting. I've got another question on hot water from Carmel, which I think is an interesting one. Carmel's got 2 dwellings on the same site, a semi-detached house and a granny flat, and has a large instantaneous gas water heater that currently provides a good supply to both of those. The gas system is about 5 meters from the studio. Carmel is keen to switch over to a heat pump, but others in the family are a bit unsure about, is that going to give enough hot water? How does the single heat pump hot water system, can it do that same job that big gas instantaneous system is doing?
Yeah, I can probably answer that. The best systems on the market are the Reclaim Energy and the Sandon. They're both actually made in the same factory. They're CO2 heat pumps. And what's to the questioner's point about the capacity, they both have a really excellent, what's called a recovery capacity. In other words, they can reheat really, really quickly. So even in a situation where you've got lots of people, then worst case is you run the tank empty and then half an hour later it's hot again. So operationally, it comes down to what mode you operate the system in. A lot of people with heat pumps that aren't stressed for capacity will operate it in a way that just boosts the tank temperature when the sun is out, so that you're using your own solar energy, and then you're just running off the tank for the rest of the 24-hour period. But if you're worried about running out of water, then you can just operate the tank. So that just operates simple thermostatically. It'll boost whenever it needs to keep the tank at temperature. And with a good system, then you can reasonably expect that you're not going to run out of hot water.
It's good to know. There's a couple of questions from people thinking about off-grid houses. One is around, can heat pumps be powered solely from solar panels, or do they draw too much energy?
Yes, the power levels are typically less than a kilowatt, and these days you can be expecting most systems are at least rated at 5 kilowatts or more and are generating at least a kilowatt most of the time the sun is out.
Yep, that's good. Any other comments on that one? No, I think we're good. And then another one a bit around the cooking. There's a couple on cooking on induction stoves, and I might put them together. And one is, can an off-grid system supply an induction cooktop? Well, given that it has very high current draw when it at certain times. And then the other related question was, well, even if an induction cooktop is relatively efficient, isn't the electric oven like 1.5 or 2 kilowatts, and how does that go with that reducing energy usage?
I'll go the oven if you do the induction, Richard.
Sure, you go. Okay,
oven. And look, we're not going to take everyone's oven away from them. I think I answered this in the chat that the cooktop is the major cooking appliance, and it's the one where a lot of people are convinced gas is the only way to do it well. So that's why we focus on switching from gas cooktops to induction. I don't know about everyone else, but I only use my oven for the occasional roast, or once a year I might make a cake. Other people obviously use theirs more. But in terms of off-grid and induction, I know it gets discussed a lot on my efficient electric home, so I'm going to handball that one to Richard.
If you're in an off-grid situation and you're worried about needing energy to cook, then yes, an oven will stretch the typical capability of an off-grid electrical system, because you might need 2.5–3 kilowatts for a good fraction of an hour. and that's a lot of power for a non-trivial chunk of time, and that can stress an off-grid system. But if you're not off-grid, then there's no problem, because even if your solar or battery, if you've got one, can't cover it for that period of time, then your main supply will be sufficient. So it's really only that off-grid situation that's a problem. And what more comes up as a practical issue with switching to electric as it applies to cooking is the power rating for the circuits needed to drive an induction cooktop. So most houses will already have their electric oven. The gas ovens aren't very common. And the question often arises, hey, I need a high capacity electrical circuit for my induction cooktop, and that's going to cost me an arm and a leg, or my house doesn't support it. So yeah, that's the reality for some people. Unfortunately, the mains electric capacity, as it's defined by peak power requirements, and the instantaneous power for some of these larger cooktops can be really quite high. So if that's your problem, then I'd suggest getting a smaller induction cooktop that has lower peak requirements. That'll be easier and cheaper to wire it in. And then if you need that extra cooking element or to service another pot or something, just get one or two portable induction cooktops. You can get these from Big W or Kmart or IKEA, or even Aldi sell them for only about $50. They just plug into a PowerPoint, and they, heck, if you want to go induction, just get rid of the cooktop entirely and just use a handful of these portable induction cooktops. People speak highly of them. I haven't used one, but they're a great way to evaluate induction cooking, and yeah, they're very, very inexpensive.
Has Dylan or Malcolm got any thoughts and experience about using cooking, Dylan?
Yeah, I'd encourage everyone to go for it. It's not like the old electric element cooking, which was a nightmare. It's a entirely different thing. It's instant, it's easy to control, and it's the only way you're going to cook without using fossil fuels. So that alone is the reason to do it, but it's actually a really good way to cook, and you can't, it's even, in some ways it's even better, like just getting, if you're boiling pasta and things like that, you've got a lot more power and control. So highly recommend it, having always used gas previously and loving gas to cook with. But yeah, love the induction cooktop.
And we're the same. We've got an induction cooktop, and in our house, as you mentioned in the intro, we've got most of the lighting and the power circuits in the house are off-grid on a battery, but the oven and cooktop and the electric car charging point are with the grid interactive circuit. So me trying to be, being an energy nerd in summer, when we had lots of battery power, I bought a IKEA portable induction cooktop and put that on top of the normal induction cooktop, so that I wasn't using any grid power, using the battery power. So I got experience with both, and they're great. $50 IKEA unit. It's got a slightly noisier fan, but otherwise it's pretty much the same as the more expensive built-in one.
Thanks, that's really useful information. I might move on to, there's a lot of questions about installation and installation related, so I'll sort of try and combine a few together. One that's come up a bit was the issues of, especially like a lot of insulation and quite airtight sort of ceiling with condensation and mold. So have any of you got some thoughts or suggestions on how do you best manage that balance between good insulation and ceiling and the risk of condensation and mold and dealing with that?
Go, Jenny.
Yeah, go, Jenny.
Richard. First of all, I'd say read my condensation management article that I published in Renew year before last. It really, you do need to think holistically. So you've got to think about your insulation, you've got to think about the air tightness and ventilation and condensation management together. But it is possible to do. This is again where I say don't get paralysed, trying to achieve perfection. So one important thing I want to differentiate is air leakage and ventilation are different things. So when we talk about air tightness, we're talking about all that random air leakage. And in most Australian homes, there's lots of it. So in a lot of existing, particularly older Australian homes, that internal lining of your house, that plasterboard lining, has got halogen downlights and ducting and all sorts of penetrations and holes through it. And moisture leaks from your home into the wall cavities and into the roof space. And that's actually the condensation problem that you've really got to be worried about. It's the condensation you can't see that's happening in the walls and the roof space that leads to mould and structural damage and big issues, which is a bit of a problem in a lot of Australian homes. So then when we talk about air tightness, sorry, I went off on a tangent there, air tightness. So we're making that internal envelope more airtight to stop that moisture getting into the wall spaces. So then more of it's trapped inside your home. So you've got to ventilate and exhaust that moist air. So you've got to design for good ventilation. So having openable windows, that's ventilation. You get to control that. So ventilation is controlled air movement. You make the decision to let it happen. But exhaust fans, the exhaust fan in your kitchen, the exhaust fan in your bathroom, and one in your laundry. Some people have one in their laundry or just an openable window. Those things let that moist air dissipate. So it doesn't have to be hugely complex. When you go for new homes, vapor permeable membranes, I think that came up. Maybe I'm going off on too much. Is that enough for starters, Dean?
There was a question about the membrane and why, for example, why you didn't use, I think, sarking when you did your house. So yeah, and maybe something briefly on that.
Sure. So Little Loft House is a 1980s house, and a lot of 1980s houses, most of them didn't even have sarking. Well, this one didn't. Certainly my old home didn't have any building wrap. So typically it was a foil sarking back then, if they did have it around the outside of the frame. So it doesn't have a wrap. The cost of putting one in is quite significant. And the main reason you do it is for moisture control and to reduce air movement past the insulation. But sometimes you've got to make compromises. So we decided not to do it, and we don't do it in a lot of our retrofit projects. Instead, again, we use that approach where we do things really well inside the house. So much less moisture is getting into the walls and roof. And in a non-sarked house, it's actually easy. The moisture does move through because there's nothing holding it in. In a new home, though, in a cold climate, you really do need a vapor permeable building wrap. And rather than go into too much detail and labour that point, read the condensation management article because it sums it up quite neatly. Is that too much to handle?
No, that's a great answer. Great answer.
Yeah, I would just add that what I usually tell my clients is it's really important to make your house airtight, but when you do, it increases the onus on the occupiers to actively ventilate when it's appropriate to do so. I've assessed many hundreds of houses, mainly in Victoria. And what's apparent from going to other people's places is a lot of people have different understanding to me about what's appropriate. In other words, lots of people never open a window. It's apparent just from going in people's houses. So if you're going to make a house airtight, which is really useful, and you're doing that in conjunction with improving the thermal envelope with insulation and glazing, then you can probably get away most of the time with having a window cracked open just a little bit, just to give sufficient exchange of air with outside without losing too much thermal comfort. And then those times when it's really hot or really cold, you still got that control that you can get just by closing up the windows entirely.
I wonder if Dylan or Malcolm have anything to add from their experience, and in particular with the straw bale construction that you've used.
Go, Malcolm.
Well, I do blower door testing too, and yeah, so like everything that Jenny and Richard said, I'd agree with. You make it airtight, but allow for controlled ventilation. The straw bale house, what can I say? I know if we, on a cold winter's night, we've got the straw bale, we've got composite windows that are double glazed. And we get a tiny bit of condensation if we don't leave the window open a crack on a cold winter's night. Yeah, but it's so much easier to manage than crappier houses we've lived in.
Yeah, I'd add to that, saying if you're buying new windows or you're building or renovating, a lot of them you can get where you can have it set to be just cracked a little bit, which gives you that airflow you need. And having those airflow paths is great. So high opening windows and allowing the air to pass like that. Also, wooden windows seem to perhaps help a little bit with that. We don't have any condensation issues. But I agree entirely, being able to control that airflow. So as long as you've built to be airtight, and then have the control to allow it when you want it.
Yeah, cool. And a bit of a related question that's just popped up in the chat from Anna. So is that sort of owner managed sort of ventilation really necessary only if you've got vapor impermeable wrap, or is it necessary in other homes as well?
Always necessary.
Yeah,
I should say, if you want to live in a healthy home, then you need to sort of switch on to ventilation. It is really important, and one of the things we've sort of overlooked because houses were so goddamn leaky in the past, we didn't need to think about it. Yes, always every house should be thinking about ventilation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. In fact, that reminds me that I've done a lot of work many years ago on issues in rental houses and found a lot of old leaky houses that still had damp and mold problems because even though they were old and leaky, there were still ventilation issues because, like you say, it's uncontrolled, right?
Yeah.
This is controlled. There is, I'm going to try and keep moving us. There's another sort of related question from Arki. What about having a very airtight house with a ventilation system, such as a heat recovery ventilation system? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I know Jenny's house has one, as does my new house. Broadly, they're a great idea. I think they're going to be much, much more widely recognised as important than they have been. There's been a lot of chatter about the need for good ventilation with COVID, and we'll increasingly, I think, value air quality more than we have. And heat recovery is a great way to get exchange of air with outside without wasting heat in the process. So I know I had a light bulb moment reading this book, Positive Energy Homes by Rob Brimblecombe, and when I really got some of the more subtle points about how heat recovery ventilation systems work. They're really, really very clever, and broadly they're in two categories. They're either centralized or decentralized. Jenny's got decentralized ones in her place, and I've got a centralized one in my new place. So mine's a ducted system from Stiebel Eltron. It's, even though I said ducting was bad, this is a sort of different kettle of fish. The ducting is entirely within the thermal envelope, so you don't have that heat loss. And every space has either a supply or a return vent. So bedrooms and living areas have supply vents, and bathrooms, utility areas, and kitchens have return vents. And so basically, there's generally an equal number. So you've got a great flow of air continually. They're completely silent. Mine consumes about 35 watts continuously, and it's just keeping that very low level, continual fresh air through the house. You don't even notice it. They're really, really good idea, and I think more houses should have them.
Well, just quickly on this topic before we move on, because we are starting to run out of time, there was a point made in one of the questions by Russell about there are some people who may not really be able to manually ventilate because of, you know, lack of mobility, etc. Is there a middle ground between sort of a, you know, an automated ventilation system and doing it yourself? Is there sort of some static ventilation that's still consistent with reasonable levels of air tightness?
You can get little trickle ventilators, ventilation systems. They use them a lot in apartments because apartments are just so intrinsically airtight to the construction method. So having a little bit of just a trickle of air all the time is really helpful. So that's one option, but the decentralised units like I've got are also potentially a good option, and they're becoming pretty much standard in our houses now that after we had that horrendous summer with the smoke was when we really realised, okay, we'll introduce these. So I've got one, for example, in my house, I only turn it on. I've got 3 pairs. I did the experiment on my house. I actually only run one of the pairs. Most of the year, I'm only using one, and it's only over winter. So it's when we tend to close the house up a bit more. But most of the year, again, I'm not making this up, Canberra's a very cold place, but a well-designed building envelope, we honestly have the window open nearly every night of the year. So we're not reliant on it in my home, but I think they are a good option. So I've got a Lunos E2, and Stiebel Eltron has some decentralised units as well, so it's something to consider. I'm about to post a link to an article I wrote about HRV and on the smoke issue in the chat for everyone too.
Great, thanks. I will do want to move on because we've only got about 10-15 minutes to go. So one very quick question about windows before we go on to some broader questions around the broader sort of energy system and how it relates to the house. So the one about windows I think that is interesting is, what's the life cycle and cost of UPVC double glazed windows with, say, aluminium ones? Does anybody have anything on that?
I've been using them in Canberra for over a decade now. As long as they've got the titanium dioxide, so tropical mix, so it's like sun cream for windows, so UV protection, and they're made with quality components. They last a long time. They've been used in the United Arab Emirates for decades now, so they do hold up in our harsh conditions here in Australia really well. We haven't had any problems. And in terms of bang for buck, UPVC gives you the best thermal performance per dollar. So it really is worth considering. They're not everyone's cup of tea, and the embodied energy argument is an interesting one. You'll hear lots of debate from aluminium versus PVC, but I think PVC beats aluminium, but of course timber is better again in terms of that. What sort of windows have you got, Malcolm and Dylan?
I've got wood, so I was quite interested in your comments there and wondering why you wouldn't consider them if you're talking bang for buck, because when I looked at windows, the good UPVC windows were more than the beautiful.
This is a really important thing to point out. Prices around the country vary enormously. So here in the ACT, there's a lot of demand for UPVC. The prices come way down. So timber double glazing is significantly more expensive than UPVC here, but I don't doubt it in Adelaide and other parts of the country. So we do timber at times, but here it is a more expensive product, but they're great.
Yeah, they seem to be great units and sealing well and everything. I guess there's just the question marks for if people want to go to a more natural product. Then wood is still an option. Or
definitely.
I think it's important that we mention that the important thing is to have window frames that don't conduct heat. So if you're going to go for aluminium, yes, they're recyclable at the end of life and whatever, but you've got to make sure you get the ones that are thermally broken. So the inside is not going to be the same temperature as the outside at any point of time. Yeah, and so the options I think in Australia, the UPVC, timber, thermally broken aluminium, and what we've got timber on the inside and aluminium on the outside. So that sort of helps with the maintenance issue outside.
Great, thank you. We've really got time for sort of one more question, and I do want to ask this one from Graham. That's about the biggest sort of picture of, especially of shifting to electric. If grid electricity comes from coal generation, how can it be less emissions than using gas?
We all want to answer this.
Well, you got 20 seconds each.
Generate your own electricity.
Yeah, good answer.
And as Richard said, it's getting cleaner all the time.
Yeah, the emissions factors for Victorian grid electricity, which is worst in the country, have improved out of sight in the last few years, and they're trending better. And if you're using so much less energy than you are gas, and you take into account an honest accounting of the emissions associated with gas, then it's really easy to get a much better emissions profile from an all-electric home, even if there's no solar.
And a lot of the states. Sorry, Jenny, go.
No, I was going to say, I don't think there's anything to add. I think you boys have covered it all. Yeah, we all agree.
I'd agree there. Just reiterating what Richard said is a lot of states do generate a lot of their power from renewables. So in South Australia, we're often above 60%, up to 100% sometimes. Tasmania obviously gets all theirs from hydro, and that's just going to keep increasing. So I don't think the coal component is a huge part of it.
Yeah, and I think the point's been really well made that the grid is changing all the time, and yeah, the electricity grid is getting cleaner, and as Richard pointed out, the gas one is getting dirtier. And we did a study in Renew a year or two ago, and it's on our website somewhere, that looked at it in different states. And yeah, Tasmania, South Australia, where there's much more renewable energy, it's really a no-brainer for all users. Like, it's cheap, it gets less emissions with electricity than using gas. And in Victoria, it's the same because of the heating. Electric heating saves so many emissions that it offsets the slightly higher emissions from electric hot water. In a few other states, it's not the case, but it's very close and it's changing. That really is the end of the time that we have for questions. There's so many more questions in the chat. It's a shame that we couldn't get to them all, but we would have had to be here for another 2 hours, I think, to get to them all. So I will remind people, as I think Richard mentioned earlier, that another place to get some of these questions answered is that My Efficient Electric Home Facebook page. It's a great source of information. Thousands of people on there, many who have really great expertise and experience. So that's a good place to get some of these questions answered. And to ask all sorts of questions about taking the journey yourself, whether through renovation or from a build, of getting your house more efficient, better performing, and moving towards all electric. So thank you everyone for asking such great questions, and our panelists and presenters for doing such a great job and answering questions. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to throw back to Maddie now.
Thanks, Dean.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the more than 300 of you who have stuck with us for the last 2 hours. We greatly appreciate your participation and also all your wonderful questions. If you're looking for a place to get specific questions answered, I will remind you that we are only in the second week of our 4 weeks of programming of webinars around Sustainable House Day. So this week is retrofitting week with very specific advice around upgrading your existing homes. Next week is all about sustainable materials. And then the week after that is all about designing for climate resilience. So you will definitely have many more chances to get your questions answered by our wonderful experts, as well as going to renew.org.au and searching around and seeing if your answer may have been addressed in an article sometime in the future, in the past, sorry. I also want to add my own thanks personally to all of our presenters, homeowners, and MC this evening. We incredibly appreciate you giving up your time to answer these questions. As someone who is looking at renovating myself, I am deeply personally invested in everything all of you have said. So my personal thanks, as well as from the communities that you help become more sustainable. We just want to remind you that this whole month will culminate in a free day of online sessions with homeowners on 17th October. That is Sustainable House Day itself. That has home tours that are already up on our website. That's got Q&As, that's got the whole shebang. It's a fantastic day. I deeply recommend it. You can register for all these events and see our open homes at sustainablehouseday.com. We'd like to thank our sponsors and council partners for making Sustainable House Day possible. And thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.